Thank you, Chrissy, and good afternoon, everyone. And I don't think I need to give any further introduction other than I think that Kazakhstan really is God's country, and you should pay it a visit. Today I'm going to talk about rare earth elements, and I've got a few slides to take you through some things you might want to consider when you're looking at those projects. And I think one of the things about rare earth elements is that most people just don't know what they are. And I don't think it's something to be ashamed about. They're very obscure. They have quite obscure applications in the main. And there's 17 of them. And they're sort of classified into heavy and light. And they're relatively abundant in the world. But in terms of economic quantities, then that's another question. There's a lot smaller subset of those, although they might occur in the Earth's crust, where we can actually recover them is much less widespread. In terms of applications, there's two main sort of categories they fall into. And that's using them as a metal that goes into various applications, or using them as an oxidized state, or as a mineral as opposed to a metal, a compound, as it were. So I'm not going to go through all of those, but there's a very wide range of uses of them. And the ones that you'll have heard of recently are how they relate to energy transition, and particularly the metals used in magnets. There's been a lot of headlines about recently, and we'll touch that a bit later on. Now, if we just look at the distribution of these rare earth deposits, you'll see that they're quite well spread around the world, and in all the sort of typical places where you find a lot of mining, the big mining jurisdictions, Southern Africa, Australia, North America. The notable gaps are, of course, Europe. And that's mainly NIMBYism. Nobody in Europe wants any mines these days. And Russia and Central Asia, there's not much, but obviously there's a big geographical concentration there in China, which is something that people have been talking about quite a lot. Now, if we look at the reserves and production, I don't think this is big news to anyone, is that, there it is, China dominates everything. And in one of the speeches or in the session before lunch, there was one of the speakers was talking about how China dominates the processing and supply of these into battery products. Well, actually, they have the majority of the reserves as well, and the production. So it really is to diversify supplies beyond China is going to take a massive effort, because, as he noted very accurately, that they've had a real head start and have been looking at this for a long time. It's not a new strategy for them, and the rest of the world is suddenly realizing they're having to play some catch-up. Now, if we look at geology, these deposits fall into four main deposit types. We've got the carbonatites, we've got mineral sands, where it tends to be a byproduct in those concentrates. We have iron exorption clay deposits, of which there's one in Kazakhstan that I'll touch on a bit later, some details of that. And then the fourth category is the alkaline rocks. And we see that the higher grade ones tend to be the carbonatites, as we'll see on the next slide when we have a look at the size and grade. There we go. Yes, so this shows a variety of rare earth deposits, and you see along the top there, they're separated into the carbonatites, the alkaline, the iron absorptions, and others. And you'll see that the alkaline deposits tend to be quite large, but low grade. All the crosses at the bottom there are quite low, and the carbonatites are a higher grade, but more variable in size. So there is a spread of the four main types in terms of what people are evaluating. So they're all quite different, but something I'll mention about the metallurgy is that they do have process routes, but that can be quite complicated. But something to note about this graph is if you look at the right-hand side of it, there's a percentage scale of the rare earth oxides in there. And you'll see, actually, when you look at many of the projects that are being promoted out there, many of the grades are quoted in parts per million, which is grams per ton. Now, 1,000 parts per million is 0.1%. So if you look on the right-hand side of that graph, you can see that there's quite a lot of low-grade projects out there, and I'll show you on the next slide one of these recent players that's looking at a project in Kazakhstan and what their grades are and how it compares to that. So it is a very difficult thing to evaluate, and that's really the theme of my talk, is that people lump them together as total rare earth oxides, but actually that can be any number of those 17 elements that we talked about. And in terms of value and economic value, the percentage recovery that you can actually achieve and the cost of doing that are the critical drivers. So it's not just a question of grade, it's about how much it's going to cost you to get it out and how much you can get out of that particular metal. Now, if we look at cutoff grades, which obviously has quite an impact. Oh, go back, sorry. Yeah. If we talk about cutoff grades, on this slide there's an extract on the right there that came from a press release from this company called East Star Resources. They're listed in London, and this is an extract for one of their press releases recently. And they quote all of these intercepts, and it's a historical rare earths mine in Kazakhstan that they're evaluating. And they've got some very nice hits there, and they've confirmed a lot of the historical results there. And that's a shallow deposit, and it's in this iron absorption clay, so it's within sort of 30, 40 meters from surface. And it's a very particular style of deposit, and it's mainly yttrium. So those grades, though, when he talks about 2,000 parts per million, that's only 0.2%. So it's still relatively low when we compare to that graph on the previous slide. So when we look at cutoff grades, typically for iron absorption clays, the cutoff grade could be very low, about 0.1%. So these numbers that we see from East Star are in the right ballpark. They're what we'd expect. But for the hard rock ores, they tend to need a much higher grade to be sustainable, and that's typically 1 to 5% total rare earth oxides in our experience. And I think that one of the things to consider from the resource geologist or from the project perspective with this is that if you've got a rare earth occurrence that has not been mined in the past or have any production history, then it's very challenging to put a value on the cutoff grade, on the recovery, because you simply don't know how much it's going to cost you to recover and the percent recovery that you'll get. So those are massive variables. So if you're selecting a cutoff grade, you might define a resource, and then when you come to do the metallurgical test work, that there's not enough metal there to pay all the bills. So I think that's a very important consideration when looking at these projects, is what is the basis of your cutoff grade? Because if you're doing a maiden mineral resource on a project that hasn't been mined, you might be doing that project and there's no metallurgical test work available, or very limited. So putting the right number on your maiden resource estimate is going to be a challenge. I guess you would just have to make an informed guess at an early stage. And as we'll see later, you'd want to do some metallurgical test work very promptly in your timeline of project evaluation. So if we just look at the metallurgy now, let's click out. There we go. And as I mentioned, metallurgy is key. It's probably one of the biggest considerations when you're looking at these kinds of projects. And we can't recover all of the metal. We know that. It's going to be a challenge. Some of these ores are refractory, that you won't be able to recover them. It's going to require multiple stages, as we'll see on the next slide. And there's a variety of products depending on application. So you might wish to recover a metal, or you might wish to recover some other mineral compound or crystal that might go into some particular application. So going a bit deeper, I think we have to consider this really as more of a chemical engineering exercise rather than commodity and traditional kind of mining. There's nothing standard about this. It's not like bottle rolls that we might have for a gold project. You do a few bottle rolls, you confirm cyanide recovery, and you know you're probably not going to have a lot more problems. Same with the base metal, you do some flotations, and you can have a pretty good idea that you've got a viable process route. But with the rare earth elements, it's much, much more challenging. So in this example here about treating a hard rock rare earth ore, that typically you'd go through all of these stages, the crushing, the grinding, and you might have to do some roasting of it. There'll be some leaching, you remove impurities, and you get to a solution where you have to do solvent extraction. And that solvent extraction stage, in theory, some metallurgists told me that if you wanted to recover all 17 from a given solution, you might need several hundred, up to 1,000 stages of solvent extraction, which I find hard to believe personally. But it was illustrating the point that these rare earth elements have very similar properties to each other, and it means they're very difficult to separate from each other. You might be able to dissolve them all, but how easily can you take them out is the key question we have to answer when we're doing something like a due diligence or just developing a project. So a good example of a MET test work sort of program is if I go back to the eStar press release, and this is a direct extract from it and what they're planning to do. They've got these good assays confirming the historical drilling results for that project, and now they're planning MET test work. And just look at it. I mentioned about what bottle rolls were like and how relatively easy bottle rolls or flotation is. Look at this, all these chemicals that I can't even say the name of some of them. And you know, what's an acetic acid leach? Is that vinegar or something? I don't know, but it's very obscure, but it's very complicated. So remember, this is a deposit where there's only 3 real elements of economic interest, and the main one, yttrium. So they're still looking at 5-stage sequential leaches just at the scoping level. So you can see the levels of complexity that we're dealing with here. It is not a slam dunk. It's very difficult to make informed decisions on limited information with a rare earths project. Now, if you think that's bad news, there's more. Radioactivity. Typically, you get radionuclides occurring in some of these rare earth elements, and when you beneficiate, you'll concentrate them and they'll end up in your saleable product. So quite often you'll have to have a stage in your processing where you remove these, and you need some kind of technology to do that, and obviously that adds to the operating costs. And obviously you've got issues with worker safety. It's not just making a saleable product. Suddenly you're dealing with radiation, and you've got to deal with ionizing radiation regulations in whichever country you're working in. Now, and then we go on to the environmental and social considerations. When you look at that list of the stages of leaching, you know, it's, all right, I made the joke about vinegar, and maybe I just wish that the reagents were as benign as something like vinegar, but they're not. There are acids and all sorts of nasty compounds that you've got to use to do this leaching. So the facilities that you build to process rare earth elements are not going to be environmentally friendly, and you're going to have to do a good job to make them environmentally friendly and socially acceptable to the communities they're situated in. So look at the example recently in Malaysia with the rare earth refinery there that I believe it's been closed down, and I don't know what impact that's going to have on the world rare earths market, but I don't think it's going to be benign. It's certainly going to probably push more production back to China. So also it uses a large amount of water and a large amount of energy. So there's some environmentally challenging and socially challenging aspects to these projects that are probably going to be harder than a conventional mining project, because it's chemical engineering, and if you're going to have a project, you're going to need a route to an off-taker, a route to a processor or a refiner as part of your technical studies. And I think, as we'll see with the conclusions, is that you need to be absolutely clear how you're going to extract your product and where you're going to sell it to. So that has implications on the planning and execution of these projects. So if we just move on and have a quick look at the market. And another key point about the market is that the supply and demand characteristics for these elements are different depending on what they are. So some of them might be more in demand than others. It's not like a blanket, they're all in demand and they've all got high prices. That's not necessarily the case. And the markets are quite opaque. They're quite difficult to determine who's producing these, where they're coming from. It's not like there's a stock exchange or these products are freely traded. Stockpiles exist with various countries around the world, and we're not sure how big they are. And some of these rare earth elements are more abundant related to others. So that's a challenge. So lumping them together as we do as total rare earth oxides is not particularly helpful when you're trying to get your sharp pencil out and do a due diligence on it. Now, I'm sort of aware of time, but if we look at the prices, there's some recent examples here of what's happened to the prices, and you can see the prices have gone up, and that's going to be driving more demand for these projects to come online. So that's obviously something in the mining sector we need. We need the higher prices to drive these things, especially given what I've just said about how hard they are to recover and process and make acceptable to the people who have to work at them or have them in their communities. Now, if we look at some recent headlines, you might have heard Elon Musk making comments about he's going to be building motors with magnets in them that don't need rare earth elements or whatever. And according to our research, we don't see any basis for that. I don't see the evidence. And also Tesla is not a huge impact on that market when you actually look at the numbers. So I think that it was just a bit of posturing for him, and he was trying to, I don't know, get people to sell him rare earth elements at lower prices or something. I'm not quite sure what he was trying to achieve. Now, on a lighter note, if you sort of look about what this means to your rare earth project, so that road to mining is going to be critically dependent on how you navigate this path to that destination. And you've got these, even though you might have some good results, you've got the challenges of metallurgy, the market, ESG, obviously in geopolitics as well, coming into it. And in the Grim Reaper there, we have Elon Musk playing the villain. Now, if we quickly just run through the risks. And I say, yeah, I've got 3 minutes left. I'm aware of that. Now, if we look at these, we can see that there's obviously a case for replacing these. If we can find things that are easier to replace them with, I think there's a very strong case for that, because these rare earth elements can be very difficult to find and extract. Also, some countries they'll withhold exports of some of these things, and we've seen that in recent years with China across a range of commodities. I mentioned about the radioactivity. One key point here is the scoping study versus the feasibility study. And I think the scoping study, you'll see on many of these projects, and I've had this personally on a battery metals project in Botswana for Guiani Metals. That was a manganese project, but the principle is the same. On that project, we did a scoping study, and when we didn't know much about recovering the metals, it was quite a fairly low operating cost. Of about $200 or $300 a ton for processing. But when we did the feasibility study work and looked at it in real detail to try and get a high purity product from a leached solution, the operating cost went up to $800 or $900 a ton. So that kind of study risk or execution risk, that it looks good at a scoping study when you don't know much, but the more work you do, the harder it becomes. And I think that is a very key point to make about these kinds of projects. I'll just click through these quickly now. I'm aware that I'm running out of time, Chrissy. Opportunities, I think there are great opportunities for these projects if you can crack the things that we were talking about earlier. And just to sort of sum up my key due diligence considerations is that you have to carefully consider the geology, the deposit type. The grade is something that is very, very tricky to sort of understand what it is and how it's derived. If there's metal equivalents used or total rare earth oxides, you need to understand those. You need to understand the process recovery of each one. Because it's like a basket of commodities and you don't know which one, where is the value in that? So beware. The other thing I'd say is that you have to have a pilot plant at an early stage with these kinds of projects. You've got to be able to demonstrate at an early stage that you can recover something saleable at a saleable cost is very important, and a pilot plant is about the only way to properly do that. And just one last point, I know I'm out of time, but the ESG factor can't be discounted as well, that you might find a perfect project, crack all these problems, and then still not be able to build it. So anyway, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.